The winter assembly at Harrogate wore its light the way a woman wears her finest jewels, deliberately and to be seen. Every candle in the county seemed gathered into the long rooms, and the mirrors doubled the flames until the air seemed spun of gold. From the road, the house looked like a lantern set down in the black cold of the moor, warm and glad and full of music. It was a beautiful thing to see from the outside. Lynette Ashcombe had learned, in a hard school, that the most beautiful things very often had a hook hidden inside them. The warmth within was real, and the music was real, and none of it was for her. A great assembly is a kind of market, though no one who dances there would be so unkind as to call it one. The young women are the goods, walked slowly down the long rooms, so the buyers may look their fill, and the business is carried on so gracefully that a girl may be sold before the second dance and never hear an ugly word. Lynette knew to the penny what she was worth in that room, and she knew exactly who had come to buy her. She stood against the far wall where the candlelight did not reach, and did the thing she always did when fear rose in her throat and threatened to show on her face. She named the plants. Foxglove, which mends a failing heart in a small dose and stops it in a large one. Feverfew, for the ache behind the eyes. Valerian, for the sleep that will not come. Her father had taught her the whole green library of them before she was 12, and the naming was the last of him left to her that no one living could take away. She named them now, one after another, and her face stayed still. Across the room, Mr. Vellacott watched her over the heads of the dancers, with the pleasant look of a man whose arrangements are going well. He had taken Lynette in when her father died, housed and fed her 2 years, and made it plain in 100 small ways that the account was now due. Beside him stood the man who had come to settle it. Sir Josiah's Penhallow was near 60, with a wide, soft face and small, quick eyes that had already gone over Lynette twice, the way a man's eyes go over a horse at a fair. He had buried 2 wives. He wanted a third, young and biddable, and got cheaply, and Vellacott had a ward who was all 3 whether she wished it or not. The dance was ending. Lynette saw Penhallow smile and begin to move toward her through the thinning couples, and understood with cold clarity that when he reached her and offered his arm before all these people, the thing would be as good as done. A girl did not refuse in the middle of a ballroom. The bright room itself would spring the trap and hold it shut. She had perhaps 10 slow heartbeats in which to save herself. And there was only one door in that whole glittering room that Sir Josiah's Penhallow would not follow her through. It was not a door of wood. It stood apart from the crowd by a cold window at the end of the room in the shape of a tall, dark man, whom not one soul in the county would go near. Everyone knew the Duke of Fenmore. No one spoke to him. He did not speak to them. He stood alone at the edge of every gathering he troubled to attend, silent and unreadable. And the county had decided long ago that he was proud, or cursed, or dangerous, or perhaps all 3 at once. Lynette crossed to him without letting herself think, for she knew that if she thought she would not do it. She laid her gloved hand on his sleeve as though she had every right to it, turned so the whole staring room would see her face lifted beside his, and spoke very low and very fast. For the next 2 hours she whispered, "You are my betrothed. Please. Only until they give it up and go home." The Duke of Fenmore looked down at her. For a long moment he did nothing at all, and the fear rose cold in her that she had thrown herself upon the only man in England colder than the one she fled, and then the Duke of Fenmore simply smiled. To understand why a gently reared young woman would fling herself upon a silent stranger sooner than be handed to a wealthy one, you must understand what had already been taken from her. 2 years before that winter, Lynette Ashcombe had been the daughter of a respected man. Her father, Dr. Edmund Ashcombe, had been a physician and apothecary of the town of Marinford, a careful and gentle man who had spent 30 years keeping the sick of that county alive. He knew more of plants and their properties than any man in the north of England. He kept his ledgers true to the grain, and his conscience truer still. He was not rich, for he forgave the poor their bills as often as he collected them, but he was trusted, and to a physician, trust is worth a great deal more than money. Then a rich old man died under his care, and that good, quiet life came down like a house of cards. The old man was Aldous Renshaw, very rich and very old, dying by slow inches of a wasting complaint the doctor had eased and could not cure. When he died at last, one raw autumn night, no one ought to have been surprised. But a great deal of money moves when a rich man dies, and where money moves, there are always hands waiting in the dark for it. Within the week it was being said that old Renshaw had not died of his complaint at all, that the draught the doctor left to ease his last nights had been no medicine but a poison, and that the gentle physician had been quietly paid to hasten a death certain persons were impatient to see. It was a lie, but it was a well-made lie, built by someone who understood exactly how such things are built. There was an apothecary's ledger showing a purchase entered in the doctor's own name, that he swore before God he had never made. There were 2 servants who suddenly remembered things they could not truly have seen. There was a grand physician brought from London, who gave it as his learned opinion that the old man had been poisoned, and once a grand man has said a thing in a grand voice, ordinary men will believe it against their own eyes. Dr. Ashcombe was ruined in a single season. He was not hanged, for the proof fell short of the rope, but proof enough, for ruin is a smaller thing than proof enough for hanging. His patience fell away. His friends discovered reasons to be elsewhere. The word poisoner fastened to his name, and would not be shaken loose. And a physician whom mothers will not suffer near their children is no physician at all. He lived a year in the shadow of it, and then he died of no illness his own art could put a name to. He died in truth of the shame. Linnet had been 22. She had sat in the crowded courtroom and heard her father say, in a voice she did not know for his, that he had never given a living soul anything but healing, that some other hand had bought that poison in his name, that he was innocent before God and men. She had believed him. She believed him still. But a daughter's belief was not evidence, and no one in the county cared to hear it. He had left her nothing but his cleared conscience and his unclean name, and it was the name the world went by. Mr. Vellacott, a distant cousin of her dead mother, had taken her in, and Linnet had understood soon enough that she had not been rescued but purchased, that a debt had begun to run the hour she crossed his threshold, and that one day he would call it in. He had called it in that winter. He had found her a buyer. The Duke of Fenmore's smile was not the thing Linnet had braced for. She had braced for coldness, or worse, the slow, cruel understanding of a powerful man who has had a frightened woman drop herself into his hands. She saw none of that. The smile that touched his hard, grave face was small and brief and strangely gentle, the smile of a man to whom something unexpected and not unwelcome has just occurred, and it changed the whole of his face for the moment it lasted. Then it was gone. He inclined his head, laid his own hand over hers where it rested on his sleeve, warm and quite steady, and turned them both to face the room as a betrothed couple faces a room, easily, as though they had done it 100 times before. He had not said one single word. Sir Josias Penhallow had crossed half the floor toward her before he saw clearly who stood at her side. Linnet watched the wide, soft face rearrange itself by slow stages, from appetite to confusion to a careful, bowing deference, for a knight of 60 with his money made in trade did not press his suit upon a woman standing beneath the hand of a duke. He found a stiff little smile and turned aside, as though he had been walking toward some other purpose all along. Against the wall, Mr. Vellacott's pleased expression had curdled into something Linnet had never once seen on it in 2 years, and enjoyed more than she could say, which was plain uncertainty. What followed were the strangest 2 hours of Linnet Ashcombe's life. The Duke walked her the length of the long, bright rooms, and the county parted before them and closed behind them in a wake of whispering. He led her once, gravely and very well, through a dance, and she found to her wonder that a man who would not speak could say a great deal with a pressure of a hand and the turn of a shoulder. For everyone knew about the Duke, and she gathered the whole of it that night from the murmurs trailing behind them. He was the greatest landowner for 40 miles about, and the loneliest man in the county, with it. He did not speak, and had not been heard to make ordinary conversation within living memory. Some said an illness had taken his voice, some said he was quietly mad, or so proud he thought the county beneath the trouble of his words. The kinder few said only that he was a strange, sorrowful man, who kept to his great house on the moor and troubled nobody, and who gave, it was murmured, enormous sums to this cause and that, always with his name kept out of it. Not one of them knew why he had chosen this night to take a ruined physician's daughter upon his arm before the whole staring county. Linnet did not know either. She had asked him for 2 hours, and he had given them without a question, and the not knowing why of it sat beneath her gratitude like a stone beneath still water. Near the end of the 2nd hour she made herself say the thing that must be said. They stood by the same cold window where she had found him, and the music was winding low. "You have been kinder than I had any right to ask," she said quietly. "They will not trouble me again tonight. Your Grace, I release you. Whatever this has cost you, I thank you for it, and you need not keep up the pretense a moment longer. I will not hold you to it." She had expected relief. She had expected him to bow and turn and melt away again into his silence, and she was surprised how much the thought of it saddened her, this stranger who had stood the whole evening between her and the cold of the room. The Duke of Fenmore did not bow, and did not turn, and did not go. Instead, he drew from his coat a small worn book, the kind a careful man keeps his accounts in, and a stub of pencil, and wrote briefly in a small even hand. He tore the leaf out, folded it once, put it into her gloved hand and closed her fingers over it with his own. Then he raised her hand to within an inch of his lips in the manner of a betrothed man taking his leave, and was gone into the crowd before she had drawn her next breath. Linnet stood alone by the cold window with the folded paper warm in her hand. Across the room Velicott was already coming for her, his soft face full of the questions he meant to put the instant the carriage doors shut them in. She opened the paper first. 3 lines in that small, even hand, and beneath them, standing larger than the rest, a single letter for a signature. "You are not safe in that house," it said. "My great-aunt has need of a companion, and I have need of nothing at all, which is what makes the offer an honest one. My carriage stands at the north door. Come tonight if you would sooner choose your own road than stand still and have it chosen for you." Linnet read it once and then again. Across the room Velicott drew nearer. The 2 hours were over. Everything they had held was over, and here in her hand was a folded page that said they need not be, that a door stood open at the north end of the loud bright room, and that a silent man she had known for the length of a single dance waited beyond it with a question she could not begin to answer. Why her? Why this night? Why at all? She closed her cold fingers over the paper, and she made her choice. She chose the north door. Afterward she could never entirely explain it, save that a page written by a stranger who asked nothing had felt, in that moment, more honest than the whole warm bright room that wanted to sell her. She slipped along the edge of the crowd while Velicott was still working his way toward her through the press, and she went out by the north door into the cold, and there in the dark a carriage stood waiting with its lamps lit exactly as the note had promised. A servant handed her up without a word, as though he had been told to expect a lady and to ask her nothing, and the door closed, and the horses moved off into the night. The town fell away behind them, and then the last of the scattered houses, and then there was nothing on either side of the glass but the black winter moor under a paring of moon. Linnet sat very straight with her hands folded in her lap and the note held tight inside her glove, and she named the plants to keep herself steady: wormwood for a bitter stomach, comfrey for a knitting bone, rue for grief. She had got herself into a stranger's carriage on the strength of 3 lines and a single letter, and every sensible voice she owned told her she had been a fool. And yet beneath the fear was a small, stubborn thing that felt absurdly like relief. She did not know the man. She knew only that he had smiled at her once and had asked her for nothing, and that the house she was fleeing had held nothing for her but a locked door and a buyer. The carriage climbed. After a long while, a shape rose against the stars ahead, and Linnet leaned to the glass and saw it, a great house standing alone on the shoulder of the moor, its long front dark but for a scatter of lit windows low down, warm and gold against all that cold Fenmore Hall. It looked less like a lantern than the assembly had, and more like a thing that had grown out of the hill and meant to stay. When the carriage drew up, the door of the house was already open, and a square of firelight lay across the frozen gravel, and an elderly woman stood waiting in it with a shawl about her shoulders and a candle in her hand, peering into the dark as though she had been watching the road some while. Linnet was handed down. She stood a moment on the gravel, cold to the bone and suddenly uncertain, a ruined girl in a borrowed evening gown at the door of a duke she did not know. The old woman lifted her candle and looked at her, and whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, for her lined face creased into something brisk and not unkind. So she said, "You came. He rather thought you would, though I told him a sensible girl would sooner take her chance with the devil she knew. Well, you are perished. I can see that from here. Come in out of it, child, before we lose you to the cold, and we will see about the rest in the morning." And Linnet, who had braced herself for a great many things on that dark drive, had not once braced herself for kindness, and found she had no defense prepared against it at all. She went in. The old woman was the Dowager Lady Marrow, and she was the Duke of Fenmore's great-aunt, and she had not stopped talking since the front door closed. She had installed Linnet in a small warm parlor off the hall, put a rug over her knees and a cup of something hot and spiced into her hands before Linnet had gathered the wit to refuse any of it, and had settled herself opposite with the air of a woman long starved of company. "I am his great-aunt," she said, "which in this house makes me very nearly the whole of the family, for there is only the 2 of us and the servants have learned not to talk, which is restful in its way and maddening in every other. You will have gathered by now that my nephew does not speak. No, do not look uncomfortable. It is the first thing anyone gathers, and there is no sense pretending around it. He has not spoken, not so that I have heard, in something near 10 years. 10 years, child. You may imagine how I have longed for a person under this roof who will simply answer me back. He is not dumb," she went on, seeing the question in Linnet's face before she could shape it. "His voice is sound enough, or was. He does not choose to use it when he must say a thing. He writes it. You will find little books and loose pages all over this house, and a pencil in every room. For that is how my nephew holds a conversation, a line at a time, in that small, neat hand of his. You had a sample of it tonight, I collect, or you would not be sitting in my parlor drinking my negus. He does not write to people. He wrote to you. I have been trying the whole way home to work out what to make of that, and I have not managed it yet." Linnet, warmed and fed and steadied at last, found her own voice. "Why did he help me?" she asked. "I am nobody. I am worse than nobody. If you know who I am, you know my name and what was said of my father." Lady Marrow's shrewd old eyes rested on her a moment, and something moved behind them that Linnet could not read. "I know your name," she said, more gently than she had said anything yet. "Ashcombe. I know the whole sorry tale of it, or as much as the papers told. As to why he helped you, that is my nephew's to tell, if ever he chooses to, and I will not answer for him. I will tell you only this. He does nothing without a reason, and he has never in his life done a cruel thing, and if he has taken an interest in you, then you are a great deal safer under this roof than you were under the one you left. That much I will swear to. "There is the matter of what you are to be while you are here," she went on, brisker now. "I am old, and I am alone in this great barn of a house 11 months of the year, and I have wanted a companion this age, and been too proud to say so. The post is real. The wages are more than fair, and they are yours, whatever else may come of this. You will read to me, and walk with me, and quarrel with me, and I shall be very glad of it. That is the honest half." She paused, and her mouth twitched. "The other half is less tidy. Half the county stood in that assembly tonight and watched my nephew take you upon his arm, as though you were promised to him. By tomorrow noon it will be in every drawing room for 40 miles. To the world, child, whether we like it or no, you are now the Duke of Fenmore's betrothed, and that is a coat we cannot easily take off you again without doing you more harm than the wearing of it. So you will be my companion within these walls, and his intended without them, until we can think of something better. I am sorry for it. It is a great deal to ask of a girl who only wanted to get out of a ballroom." Lynette sat very still, holding the cooling cup, and understood that the 2 hours had not merely failed to end. They had grown roots. Later, when Lady Marrow had at last run down like a clock, and a silent maid had shown Lynette up a wide, dark staircase to a room that was warm and ready, and had plainly been made up for her before ever she agreed to come, she found a thing upon the pillow that stopped her at the threshold. It was a single folded page, with a pencil laid neatly across it. She opened it one line. In the small, even hand, she was beginning to know. "You are safe here. Ask for anything you lack. You owe me nothing, tonight or ever." There was no demand in it. There was no price. And that, after 2 years in Vellicott's house, was the most bewildering thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. The price would come. Lynette was as sure of that as she was of the sunrise. She had learned it in Vellicott's house, learned it thoroughly, the way one learns a language by being struck with it. Nothing was given, everything was lent, at interest. A new gown meant a debt to be worked off in gratitude and obedience. A kind word meant a harder demand coming along behind it. And so on her first morning at Fenmore Hall, waking in a warm room with the winter light on an unfamiliar ceiling, her very first clear thought was not wonder, but arithmetic. She lay still and totted up what she had already been given: the carriage, the fire, the food, the room, the post, and she braced herself to learn the size of the reckoning, and the reckoning did not come. Instead, the kindnesses only multiplied, each one adding to her mind. Another line to a bill she was not permitted to see. On the second day, a warm winter cloak of gray wool appeared across the foot of her bed, her own thin evening things being no match for the Moor, and no one said a word about it or waited to be thanked. On the third, the library was opened to her without her asking, the housekeeper mentioning only that His Grace had said the young lady might take any book she pleased, and keep it as long as she liked. She was given a fire in her room, and hot water when she wanted it, and a place at the table as though she belonged there. Every one of these things Lynette received with a stiff and wary gratitude, and every one of them she added in silence to the sum, and every night she lay down certain that tomorrow, surely tomorrow, the account would be called. The days that followed did not go as she had braced for them to go. She saw little of the Duke at first, and never alone. He took his dinner with them each evening at the long table, silent at its head, and she found that a meal may be shared with a man who does not speak and be no colder for it. For Lady Marrow talked enough for a table of 12, and the Duke listened, and now and then when his great-aunt said a thing outrageous enough, the corner of his mouth would move in that brief, rare way Lynette was learning to watch for. He never addressed her across the table, but some evenings, a small folded page would appear beside her plate, set there by his hand as he passed, and she would open it later in her room and find a line of the driest wit imaginable, a remark upon the day, a question about the book she had been reading to his aunt, and once a single sentence that made her laugh aloud alone in the dark. She began to answer them. It seemed rude not to. She would write her reply in her own hand on the same page, and leave it on the small table by the library door, and by morning it would be gone, and a day or two later another would come. It was the strangest courtship in England, if it was a courtship at all, conducted entirely in pencil, a line at a time, never a word aloud. Linnet told herself firmly that it was nothing of the kind, that it was merely how one spoke to a man who would not speak, and she went on telling herself so for rather longer than the facts supported. There was, she discovered, a walled garden on the south side of the house, long neglected, its beds gone to frost and bramble, and one gray afternoon, walking there alone, she had knelt without thinking and cleared the dead growth from a low, woody plant and known it at once for rosemary, gone half wild, but living still. She had said nothing of it to anyone. Yet 2 days later, a note came that said only, "The old physic garden has wanted a knowing hand these 10 years, and it is yours if you would have it. Send to the steward for whatever you require." She had stood in the cold, with the page in her hand, and understood that he had been watching more closely than she knew, that he had found the one gift in all his great house that could reach the part of her that still belonged to her father, and had given it without a word or a claim. One evening, the note beside her plate was not dry, and was not witty. "I have watched you brace yourself every morning for a blow that is not going to fall," it said. "I know the house you came from. You need not flinch in this one. Whatever you are waiting for me to demand of you, I will not demand it. There is no bill. I would take it as a kindness if you would stop counting." Linnet read it 3 times. Then she folded it very small, and held it in her closed hand through the whole of dinner, and she could not have said why her eyes stung so, except that no one had told her such a thing in longer than she cared to remember. Still she did not quite believe it. Belief, when it has been beaten out of a person, does not come back all at once, and so, some days later, she did a reckless thing. She went to find him. She found the Duke in the library at the west end of the house, where a great fire burned and the tall shelves went up into shadow, and he sat at a writing table with his back to the door and papers under his hand. He rose when he saw her, courteous as ever, and waited. Linnet had meant to be composed. Instead, the words came out of her in a rush, all the fear of a fortnight in them. "What do you want of me?" she said. "Please!" "I cannot bear the waiting of it. Men do not do what you have done for nothing, whatever your aunt says. Ah, you have given me shelter and a name and your protection before the whole county, and I am not such a fool as to think it cost you nothing, and I would rather know the price now tonight than lie awake another night, waiting to be told it. So tell me, what is it you want?" The Duke of Fenmore looked at her a long moment across the firelit room. Then he sat, and drew a page toward him and wrote, and rose again, and crossed to her, and put it into her hand. "I want you to be somewhere you are not afraid," it said. "That is the whole of it. It is not a price. It is the reason." She stared at the line until it blurred. "But why?" she whispered. "Why me?" And for the first time since she had known him, the Duke of Fenmore hesitated. She saw it plainly, the pause, the shadow of something held back, the pencil not quite touching the page. Then he wrote one more line, shorter than the first, and gave it to her, and this one he did not wait to see her read. He inclined his head, and left her alone in the great warm library with the fire and the shadows and the page in her hand. Linnet looked down. "Because I knew your father," it said. The fire cracked in the grate. Somewhere far off in the house a door closed. Linnet stood quite still with the little page trembling in her fingers, for in 2 years not one living soul had spoken of her father except to spit the word poisoner after his name, and here was a silent duke who had known him, and would not say how, and had walked out of the room sooner than be asked. She turned, slowly, toward the writing table he had left. The papers lay where his hand had covered them. She should not have looked. She knew it, even as she crossed the room, even as she leaned above the table in the firelight, even as her own eyes found and fixed upon the topmost page and the name written plainly at its head. It was her father's name, Edmund Ashcombe. And below it, in column after column, in the Duke's own small even hand, page upon page upon page, was every particular of the case that had killed him. The Duke of Fenmore had been gathering the ruin of her father for a very long time. Why? She did not sleep that night. She sat by the dying fire in her warm, ready room with the single page held in both hands, her father's name upon it, in a stranger's careful script, and she turned the thing over and over in her mind and could make nothing of it that did not frighten her. A duke who did not speak. A duke who had known her father and would not say how. A duke who had gathered page upon patient page, the whole record of the case that had killed a country physician nobody else in England had thought worth a second thought. She did not know whether she had fallen among friends or into some deeper snare than the one she had fled, and by the gray of morning she had resolved that she would not spend another hour, not knowing. She found him early, before the house was properly awake, in the same library, as though he had never left it. He was standing at the tall window with a cup of coffee cooling untouched at his elbow and the winter light hard on his face, and when she came in with the page held out before her like an accusation, he did not startle and did not pretend and did not look away. He simply looked at her and waited in that grave, still way of his for her to say what she had come to say. "I saw these," said Linnet. "I know I ought not to have, but I saw them, and I have his name in your hand, and I will not be managed and soothed and kept in the dark a day longer. You told me you knew my father. I am asking you now to tell me the rest, all of it, whatever it is." For a long moment, the Duke of Fenmore did nothing at all. Then he crossed to the writing table, and he did not reach for a fresh page, but instead unlocked a drawer she had not seen him open before, and drew from it a thick-bound book, worn at the corners with handling, and he laid it in her hands. She opened it, and saw that it was full, front to back, of the same small, even hand, dated and ordered, year upon year of it. It was not a ledger of accounts. It was a case. It was the patient, relentless assembling of a truth, built the way a physician builds a diagnosis, symptom by symptom, until only one conclusion can stand. Read it. He had written on the first leaf long ago in a hand a little younger than the one she knew. If you are reading this, then I have failed to finish it in time, and it falls to another. The man whose name stands here was innocent. I mean to prove it, though it take me the rest of my life. Linnet sank into the chair by the fire and read, and the Duke of Fenmore let her, standing quiet at the window with the light on his shoulders, asking nothing, hurrying nothing, while a woman he had rescued read the secret work of his hidden years. It took her the better part of the morning, and when she raised her head at last her face was wet and she had not known it. "You have been doing this for 2 years," she said. "Alone, in secret, for a man you say you knew. Why? What was my father to you, that you would give your years to him and never once let your name be spoken in it?" And the Duke wrote, on a fresh page, the first line of the answer she had been waiting for. "He saved my life," it said, "when I was a boy of 9, and every grand physician in the north had given me up." Linnet stared at the words, and then at him, and the whole cold portrait she had been assembling of him, the mad recluse, the proud strange duke, cracked clean across and fell away. And behind it stood something she had not expected at all, which was a man carrying a debt he had never been permitted to repay. That was the beginning of the strangest season of Linnet Ashcombe's life, and the happiest, though she would not have called it that at the time. For once the secret was shared, the work became a thing they did together. She had grown up at a physician's elbow. She knew the names of the drugs in the case as the Duke did not, knew which doses eased and which killed, and which no honest apothecary would ever confuse for another, and within a week she had found, in his careful pages, 3 things he had recorded faithfully, without understanding their weight, and had shown him what they meant, and had watched his grave face change as a locked door changes, when at last the right key turns in it. They worked at the long table through the short winter afternoons, the papers spread between them, and they spoke, in their fashion, more than either of them had spoken to another soul in years. He wrote. She answered aloud. And somewhere in the passing of pencil and page across that table, the thing that had begun as a lie in a ballroom quietly, without either of them marking the hour of it, became something else. She learned other things of him in those weeks, by accident, for he never told them of himself. She learned from Lady Marrow, who could keep a secret about as long as a sieve keeps water, that the enormous silent gifts the county whispered of were real, that half the roofs mended and half the debts quietly paid for 40 miles about had his hand behind them and never his name, that he had schooled and dowered and set up in trade more people than his great-aunt could count, and had forbidden the thanks of everyone, was, Linnet came slowly to understand, the most generous man she had ever known, and had arranged his whole life so that no living person might ever tell him so to his face. "I do not understand you," she told him one afternoon, half laughing, half something warmer. "You give everything and hide the giving. You saved my father, though you could not save him. You have taken in the daughter of the most disgraced name in the county, and set her at your own table, and you will not so much as let me thank you." He wrote his answer and turned the page to her. "Thanks are a kind of debt," it said. "I have spent my life trying to give things that leave no debt behind them. It is the only clean way I know to give." And then, beneath it, after a pause in which she watched him weigh whether to write the next thing at all, he added a second line in a smaller hand. "You owe me nothing, Linnet. But I find lately that I would give a great deal to owe something to you." She did not answer that. She could not. She sat with the page in her hand and her heart going hard, and across the table the Duke of Fenmore watched her with the whole of his still grave attention, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to, for the truth of it was there on the table between them, plain as any of his careful pages. The 2 hours had become a winter, the pretense had become the only real thing in her life. That night she went to Lady Marrow, for there was one thing the Duke would not write, and she found she had to know. She had glimpsed it at the edges of his careful pages, a wound older than her father's case, the shape of whatever it was that had first stopped his voice. "Tell me," she said to the old woman. He was not born silent. Something silenced him. "If I am to stand where I am standing, I think I have a right to know what it was." Lady Marrow looked at her a long while, and for once she did not reach at once for words. When she spoke, it was quietly, and without any of her usual armor. "You do have the right," she said. "More than anyone living now, I think. Sit, child. It is not a happy tale, and I have carried it alone a long time. To understand the Duke of Fenmore," Lady Marrow said, "you must first understand that he was not always a silent man. As a boy, he was the noisiest child in 3 counties, forever talking, forever certain that if a thing were only true, and one said it plainly enough, the world must in the end come round to it. He believed that as other children believe in fairies, and with about as much cause, and the world took its time in teaching him otherwise. He was 9 when the fever took him. I was here. I saw it. The great men came from York and from London with their fine words and their lancets, and they bled him, and they shook their heads, and they told his mother to prepare herself, and they went away, and your father came. A young country physician nobody had heard of, who would not bleed a dying child because he said the child had no blood to spare, who sat by that bed 4 days and 4 nights, and did 100 small, unfashionable things that the great men would have scorned, and who gave my nephew back to us alive. We did not forget it. One does not forget the man who gives one back one's child. His mother kept a place laid for your father at her table every Christmas of her life after, and my nephew most of all was his debtor, for it was his own small hand your father had held through those 4 black nights, and a child does not forget the face that stood between him and the dark. The Duke grew up, went on Lady Marrow, and came young to his title, and carried that same boy's faith in the power of a plainly spoken truth into a hard-grown matter. I will not lay out for you tonight, save to say that he stood up in a public place, a young man of 19, with right on his side and nothing in his hand but his own certainty. And he told the truth, and named a powerful man who had done a wicked thing. And the powerful man had money and reputation and clever friends, and he turned my nephew's truth inside out before the whole county, until the boy stood there looking like a hysteric who did not know the way of the world. His word was set at nothing, worse than nothing, and an innocent person was destroyed for want of the proof my nephew did not have. He came home from that, said Lady Marrow, and he did not speak of it, and then in a little while he did not speak at all. I think at first it was grief and shame and a boy's black despair, but it hardened, as such things do, into something more like a vow. He had learned, you see, the cruelest lesson the world had to teach a truthful boy, that a spoken word, however true, is only air, and the world will blow it away, and that the only thing the world cannot blow away is proof. So he stopped spending words. He resolved that when next he held a truth worth the telling, he would not open his mouth upon it until he had built beneath it a floor of proof so solid that no rich man's money and no grand man's reputation could ever laugh it down again. Lady Marrow was quiet a moment, and then, 2 years ago, she said, the one man in the world he owed his very life to was accused of a killing he did not commit, by exactly the kind of manufactured lie my nephew had spent 10 years learning to see through your father. He knew within a week that it was false. He knew, I think, almost within a week whose hand was behind it. But knowing is not proving, and he had sworn a bitter oath never again to speak before he could prove. And so he worked, in silence, as fast as ever he could, and he was not fast enough. Your father died before the proof was whole. My nephew has never forgiven himself for it. He was too late to save the man. He has given every hour since to being not too late to save the name. You asked me once why he helped you, said Lady Marrow. Now you know the whole of it. He could not save the father, and so he set himself to save the daughter. And I think he meant it at first as the last payment on a debt he could never otherwise discharge. I say he meant it so at first. I have watched him this winter, child, and I do not think it has stayed a payment. But that is not mine to tell you, that you must get from him. Linnet sat very still in the firelight, and understood at last the whole shape of the thing she had walked into, and understood, too, with a cold, slow dread, the question that came behind the understanding. For if the Duke of Fenmore had taken her in out of a debt he could not pay to a dead man, then what was she to him? Truly, a person, or a penance. She hardly slept for 3 nights turning it. It would have been easier in a way if he had been cruel. Cruelty she knew how to stand against, but this was worse, this suspicion that every warm thing that had grown between them over the winter had grown in soil she could not trust, that when he looked at her with that grave attention, it was not Linnet he saw at all, but Edmund Ashcombe's daughter, a debt in a grey wool cloak, away at last to lay down a burden he had carried too long. She thought of the note, I would give a great deal to owe something to you, and she thought, and could not stop thinking, that a man may say such a thing to the living, when what he truly longs to settle is with the dead. She tried to reason herself out of it, and could not. Every kindness she counted now cut 2 ways. The physic garden, the grey wool cloak, the open library, the notes laid beside her plate. Had he given them to Linnet, or to the ghost of the man he had failed? She could not tell, and the not telling was a splinter she could not reach. She had spent 2 years being nobody, and she had borne it, after a fashion. She did not think she could bear being loved for someone else's sake, which was only a finer and crueler kind of being nobody. Better, the honest cold of Velikot's house where at least no one had pretended, then a warmth that was not, when you came down to the bottom of it, quite meant for her. On the fourth day she went to find him, and this time she did not bring an accusation. She brought the truth, which was harder. "I know now why you took me in," she said. "Your aunt told me. All of it. The fever and my father and what you owe him and could never pay." She stopped and made herself go on. "And I have to ask you a thing, and I have to ask you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer unmakes everything. Am I a person to you, or am I the last page of his case? Because I have been bought and priced and traded once already in my life, and I find I would rather go back to Velikot this very day than stay here as the settling of a debt, however kindly meant. I would rather be no one's than be a payment." She had braced for him to write. He did not write. He stood very still, and something worked in his face that she had never seen there. A kind of struggle as though a door long rusted shut were being forced from the inside, and his hand rose halfway to the pencil and stopped. And Linnet understood, watching him, that for the first time since she had known him the written word was not enough for what he had to say, and that he knew it, and that he did not know how to do the other thing anymore. "It is all right," she said softly, gentler now, her own quarrel forgotten in the sight of his struggle. "Write it. I will believe your hand. I have always believed your hand," he wrote, and his hand was not quite steady. "You came into this house as his daughter," it said. "I will not lie to you and say otherwise, but you have not been his daughter to me for a long while now. I do not know the hour it changed. I know only that I no longer think of the debt when I think of you, and that I think of you a great deal, and that the notion of your going back to that man puts a cold in me that has nothing of penance in it. You are not the last page of his case, Linnet. You are the first page of something I had stopped believing I was allowed." She read it twice. Then she looked up and found him watching her, with his whole heart plain in his grave face for once, all his careful stillness fallen away, and she did the thing she had wanted to do for weeks, and had not let herself do. She crossed the small space between them, and she took his hand, the hand that wrote in both of hers, and she held it. His fingers closed hard over hers, and she felt the fine tremor still in them, the effort of everything he had just failed to say aloud and managed to set down instead, and it undid the last of her doubt more surely than any smooth-spoken speech could have done. A man does not tremble over a debt. A man trembles over a hope. "I am not going back," she said. "Not to him, not anywhere. I am staying, not because you saved my father, because I choose it. Because whatever this began as, it is not that any longer, and we both of us know it, and I am done pretending in this house that has given me everything but the one true thing I have wanted for a month, which is to stop pretending." The Duke of Fenmore lifted her hand the way he had that first night in the ballroom, but he did not stop an inch short of it this time. And for a while there was no need of pencil or page or any word at all spoken or written in the warm, bright library at the west end of the house. They should have known it could not last unchallenged. Happiness of that kind is a loud thing, however quietly it is kept, and the county had ears. The letter came on a hard, bright morning near the turn of the year, carried up from the town by a servant, and laid on the breakfast table. And Lady Marrow took it up and read the direction and went still in a way that made Linnet set down her cup. "It is from Lady Corvain," she said. The name meant nothing to Linnet then. It would come to mean a great deal. Lady Corvain was the widow of Sir Gervas Corvain, and Sir Gervas Corvain, though Linnet did not yet know it, was the powerful man whose wicked thing the young Duke had once tried and failed to name, and he was also, though the proof of it lay half assembled in a locked drawer in the library, the hand that had bought a poison in Edmund Ashcombe's name, and let a good man hang for it in all but the rope. He was 2 years dead. His widow guarded his fortune, and his memory, and the buried truth of how both had been got, with the ferocity of a woman who has a great deal to lose and knows exactly how much. She had heard, the letter said, in the smooth, poured words of a woman who has never once in her life said a thing plainly, of the Duke of Fenmore's remarkable generosity in taking under his roof a young person of such very unfortunate connections. She was all admiration for his charity. She wondered only, as a friend of the family and one who held the county's good name dear, whether his grace had fully considered how the world might construe so singular an arrangement, and whether the young person in question had been quite honest with him as to her history. She proposed to do herself the honor of calling. She looked forward to making the young person's acquaintance. She was, and so forth, his most affectionate and concerned, and so forth. It was a threat, dressed as a courtesy, and every soul at that table knew it. "She knows," said Lady Marrow grimly, folding the letter small. "She has always known what her husband was. And she has heard that my nephew is close to proving it, and she has found out that Edmund Ashcombe's daughter is under this roof, and she means to strike first before the proof is whole, and to strike where we are softest. Which is you, child." Linnet looked from the old woman's hard face to the Duke's, which had gone very still and very cold, the face of the man from the ballroom, and she felt the warmth of the winter begin to run out of the room like heat from an open door. Lady Corvain did not wait long, and she did not come alone. She came, in the end, to the great subscription assembly held every year at the turning of the season in the county town, the largest gathering for 40 miles, the very glass in which the whole county saw and judged itself, and she came, having spent the fortnight before it well. For a woman with money and malice and a fortnight can accomplish a very great deal by way of whispering, and by the night of the assembly, there was not a drawing-room in the county that had not been visited by some soft version of the same tale, that the Duke of Fenmore, poor mad, silent creature, had been imposed upon, that the woman on his arm was no more his betrothed than the scullery maid, that she was the poisoner's daughter, Ashcombe's girl, run off from her lawful guardian and installed at Fenmore Hall under a false engagement to trap a helpless recluse in his fortune. It was a clever tale, because it took the truth that Linnet had indeed pulled a stranger into a false betrothal and poured poison into it, and gave it back wearing the face of a fraud. They went to the assembly, because not to go was to concede it. Lady Marrow was fierce on the point. "You do not answer a whisper by hiding," she said. "You answer it by walking into the middle of the room with your chin up and letting them look." And so they went, the three of them, and Linnet wore a gown the Duke had somehow caused to appear, and she walked in on his arm into the same kind of bright, loud watching room where the whole strange story had begun, and she felt the weight of every eye in it turn and fasten on her, and knew that this time they were not merely appraising. This time they had been told what to see. She named the plants. Standing at the Duke's side, under all those eyes with her face composed, she named them silently one after another as she had in the first assembly, foxglove and feverfew and rue, the last of her father with her in the worst room she had ever entered, and she kept her chin up, and she did not run. Lady Corvain let the room do its work for the better part of an hour before she crossed the floor. She was a handsome woman of middle years, beautifully gowned, with a soft, pleasant face and eyes like 2 chips of river ice, and she came with Velicott at her shoulder, Velicott whom Linnet had last seen curdled with uncertainty in this same county's other ballroom, restored now to smugness by the powerful new friend who had use for him. And behind Velicott, wide and soft and patient as ever, Sir Josias Penhallow, come to collect at last the property he still believed he had been promised. They had arranged it so that it must happen before the greatest possible number of people. That was the whole art of it. "What a charming gown," said Lady Corvain to Linnet, in a voice pitched to Carrie. "One would never take you for a fugitive from justice. Tell me, does his grace know that his intended is a runaway ward, with a price on her disobedience, or have you contrived to keep even that from the poor silent man?" "No, do not trouble to answer. Mr. Velicott here has told me the whole of it, and I have told, I am afraid, a very great many people, for I do hold the good name of this county dear, and I could not stand quietly by and watch a helpless gentleman be made the victim of a poisoner's daughter and her schemes." The word poisoner fell into the listening room like a stone into a still pool, and the rings of it went out and out. Linnet felt the whole assembly draw its breath. "I think," Lady Corvain went on, sweetly turning now to include the Duke, "that the kindest thing, your Grace the merciful thing, would be to let this unfortunate young woman be restored to her proper guardian, who has generously agreed to overlook her flight, and to an honorable marriage that has been most patiently held open for her. Sir Josias is not a proud man. He is willing, even now, to take her as she is. Surely that is a happier ending for all than the ruin of a great and ancient name. Surely you would not, for the sake of a month's strange fancy, hand the dukedom of Fenmore to the daughter of a man who murdered his patient for money." And there it was, the trap, sprung, in the middle of the brightest room in the county, exactly as it had been designed. To keep Linnet, the Duke must stand in that room and fight, and he was a man who had not spoken a word aloud in 10 years, a man the whole county thought mad or cursed or dumb, and every soul present knew it, and Lady Corvain knew it best of all. She had built her whole assault upon the one certainty that the silent Duke of Fenmore could not, would not, defend the woman on his arm, because to do so he would have to do the one thing he had not done in a decade, and do it here, now, cold, before them all. Linnet looked at his face and saw what it cost him even to be asked, and she made, in that moment, the second choice that would shape the rest of her life. She would not let him be broken here, for her sake. She would not be the thing that forced him back into the shame of 10 years ago, standing in a public room with a truth in his mouth and no one willing to hear it. Better she should go. Better she should be a debt paid and a page closed than the ruin of the one good man she had ever known. She released his arm. "You are right," she said to Lady Corvain clearly, "so that it carried as far as the cruelty had. I have imposed upon his Grace long enough. I will go back. Let no one say the Duke of Fenmore was anything in this but generous to a fault to a woman who did not deserve it." And she turned, with her chin still up and her father's herb still on her silent lips, and she walked away from him, out through the parting whispering crowd, toward the door, and Velicott and the whole of the ruin she had run from, because it was the only gift she had left to give the man she loved, and she gave it. Behind her, in the ringing silence of the great assembly, the Duke of Fenmore opened his mouth. "Stop." The word came out of him rough and cracked and strange, a voice 10 years unused, and it was not loud, and yet it fell into that silent room like a shot, and Linnet froze in the middle of the floor with her back to him, not daring to believe she had heard it. How? For 10 years no one in that county had heard the Duke of Fenmore speak. Children had been born and grown who thought him mute from birth. His own great-aunt had gone whole seasons with nothing of his voice to keep her company. And into the ringing silence of the largest room in the county he had just spent a single cracked word, and spent it upon her, and the shock of it went through the assembly like a wind through standing corn. Linnet turned. She could not have kept from turning if her life had hung upon her stillness. He crossed the room to her. She heard the whole assembly hold its breath as he came, and he took her hand and turned her gently to face him, and he spoke again, low and only for her, though the nearest of them heard it and carried it out ever after as the great wonder of that night. "Not you," he said, in that rusted, breaking voice, each word plainly costing him, and each word plainly worth it. "Never you. I have been silent 10 years, Linnet, waiting to have proof enough to be believed. I will not wait another hour. Stay and hear me be believed." Linnet looked up into the grave face. She had come to know better than her own, and saw that the silence was truly broken, that he had reached across 10 years and the whole width of that staring room, and put his recovered voice into her hands, like a gift held out in the open palm, and she found she could not speak at all. She who had always had words where he had none, she only nodded once, and closed her hand tight around his and stayed. And then he turned, still holding her hand, to face the room that had come to watch her destroyed, and the Duke of Fenmore, who had not spent a word upon the world in 10 years, began, at last, to speak. "My name," he said, and his voice steadied as he used it, "is Aldrich Fenmore, and I have not spoken in this county for 10 years, and you have, all of you, had a great deal to say about the reason. Tonight you will hear the truth of it from me, and you will hear something more besides, and I ask you to listen because I have spent 10 years earning the right to be listened to, and I have it here, in my hand, on paper none of you can wave away." He drew from his coat a folded packet, and he did not raise his voice. And he did not need to, for you could have heard a pin fall in that room. 2 years ago, he said, Dr. Edmund Ashcombe of Marinford was accused of poisoning his patient Aldous Renshaw for money. He was ruined for it, and he died of it, and this county called him guilty and thought no more about it. Dr. Ashcombe was innocent. I know it because he saved my life when I was a child, and because I have spent 2 years proving what I knew, and because I hold in my hand the apothecary's true daybook, the original, not the forged copy that damned him, which shows plainly that the poison charged to his account was purchased on that day by another man entirely, a manservant in the pay of the very person who inherited old Renshaw's fortune the week he died. You were told, he went on, and his rough voice was steadier with every sentence, as a rusted hinge eases with working, that a grand physician came all the way from London and swore upon his reputation that the old man had been poisoned. He did come, and he did swear it, and he was paid handsomely for the journey and the opinion both, by the same hand, and I hold the record of that payment. You were told there was a purchase of poison entered in Dr. Ashcombe's own name. There was. It was entered 3 weeks after old Renshaw was already in his grave, in a different ink, by a different pen, into a book that had been got hold of for the purpose. I have had that entry examined by men who spend their lives at such work, and they will swear in any court in England that it is a forgery. Every stone of the case that killed that good man was laid by design, and I can show you the hand that laid each one. He let that settle. Then he went on, and now he turned his grave eyes upon Lady Corvain, whose soft, pleasant face had gone the color of ash. I hold. Also, he said, the confession, signed and witnessed before a magistrate this week past, of one of the 2 servants who swore falsely against Dr. Ashcombe at his hearing. She is old now, and dying, and did not wish to carry it further. She has sworn that she was paid to lie, and she has named the man who paid her. His name was Sir Gervas Corvain. He poisoned his own uncle for the inheritance, and he bought an innocent physician's ruin to cover it, and he died 2 years too soon to answer for either. But the truth of it does not die with the man, and it does not belong to his widow to bury, however dear she holds the good name of this county. The room turned as one to look at Lady Corvain. She had come to that assembly to see the accused physician's daughter destroyed, and she stood now in the wreck of her own long lie, with 100 of her neighbors staring, and she opened her mouth, and for once in her poured smooth life. She found that she had nothing to say that would not damn her further, and she closed it again. It is a terrible thing to watch a lie die in a crowded room. The people nearest her drew back a little, the way people draw back from a thing that has begun to spoil, and the whispering that had been all for linnet not an hour before turned now, the whole tide of it, the other way. Lady Corvain stood in the cold center of it and felt the county she had ruled by fear and favor for 20 years turn its face from her in the space of a quarter hour. She had come to that assembly to break a poisoner's daughter. She had carried into the one room where it could do her the most harm the man who had spent 10 silent years forging the single key that opened her whole buried house. The magistrate was sent for. He was, as it happened, already in the room, an old man named Sir Alured Bevan, who had known Edmund Ashcombe slightly and had always been quietly uneasy about the case, and he took the daybook and the confession into his own hands and read them there, before them all. "This will be looked into," he said, in the tone of a man who already knows what the looking will find, "and it will be looked into properly and publicly. And I think, Your Grace, that before the spring is out, this county will have a great deal to be ashamed of, and one name at least to set right." He turned to Linnet, and he bowed to her, an old man bowing to a young woman before the whole assembly that had come to spit at her. "I knew your father a little," he said. "He was a good physician, and I believe now he was a wronged man, and I am sorry, on behalf of a great many people who will not have the grace to say it themselves." She could not answer him. She looked instead for the Duke, and found him already at her side, and he did not let go of her hand, and he did not sit down, and she understood that he did not mean ever again to stand silent in a room while someone he loved was wronged in it. Whatever it had cost him to break 10 years of silence, he had spent it gladly and all at once, and he did not look like a man counting the price. He looked like a man who had at last been allowed to set down a thing he had carried too long and found his arms the lighter for it. And Linnet, who had walked into that room the poisoner's daughter, and stood now in the middle of it while a magistrate bowed and begged her pardon, felt something she had held clenched tight for 2 long years begin, at last, to come loose. It was not tidy after that, for the world seldom is, and the full clearing of Edmund Ashcombe's name took the law its own slow months to accomplish. But the night of the assembly broke the back of the lie, and everything after was only the long working out of it. The magistrate was as good as his word. There was a formal inquiry in the spring, and it found what everyone by then already knew, and the finding was published and read out in the county town, and Edmund Ashcombe was declared, in the dry, final language of the same law that had once destroyed him, to have been wrongly accused and wholly innocent of the death of Aldous Renshaw. It was a small, dry sentence to set against 2 years of ruin and a good man in his grave. But Linnet had it copied out fair and framed, and she hung it where she could see it, for she had learned in the hardest possible school exactly what a sentence of that kind was worth, having lived so long beneath its opposite. The county subscribed, rather sheepishly, to a new stone for her father's grave, the old one having borne only his name and his dates, and the silence of people ashamed to say more. The new stone called him a physician of this county, who saved many and was ill repaid, and that was near the truth, though still Linnet thought a good deal short of the whole of it. Sir Gervas Corvain could not be tried, being dead, but his crime was established past any decent doubt, and the county that had shunned a physician's daughter discovered in itself a sudden warm memory of having always thought poor Dr. Ashcombe hardly the type. Lady Corvain left the county before the spring, and did not come back, taking her river ice-eyes and her poured smooth voice to some other place that did not yet know her. Mr. Vellicott, finding his powerful friend, fled, and his own part in the whispering not so private as he had hoped, discovered pressing reasons to be a very long way off, and the debt he had thought to collect on Linnet's obedience was quietly understood by everyone, himself included, to be a thing best never mentioned again. Sir Josias Penhallow went looking, no doubt, for some other young woman with no one to stand between her and his patients, and it is a mercy of this tale that we need not follow him to see whether he found one. For Linnet the change was stranger than for anyone. She had been 2 years a thing to be looked away from, and she woke one morning that spring to find herself a person the county wished, rather anxiously, to have always been kind to. Invitations came that would have been unthinkable a month before. Women who had crossed streets to avoid her now crossed rooms to reach her. She bore it with more grace than they deserved and less warmth than they hoped, but she took no revenge on any of them beyond the revenge of being plainly and permanently happy. And the Duke was learning to speak again. It did not come back all at once or easily. There were days the words would not come, and he reached from 10 years of habit for the pencil, and Linnet learned when to wait and when to fetch the little book herself and lay it in his hand without a word, for she loved his rough voice, but she had fallen for his silence first and would not have him think the one had made the other worthless. But it came. Month by month he spoke to the servants, who very nearly dropped what they were carrying the first time. He spoke to Lady Marrow, who declared it a great nuisance after so many restful years, and then wept about it in her room where no one could see. And he spoke to Linnet in the evenings, by the fire. More and more, all the 10 years of unsaid things coming out of him slowly in that low-mended voice into the only ears he had ever truly wished to fill. It was a curious thing, Linnet often thought, to be courted in reverse. She had been wooed in silence and had learned the whole of the man before ever she heard him say her name. And so when he did at last say it, in the firelight, in that unpracticed voice worn softer as the winter turned to spring, it meant more to her than 1,000 fluent men could have made it mean. Linnet. He said it as though it were the first word he had ever chosen freely to speak, which in a way it was. And Linnet Ashcombe wept for her father. She had not been able to, in all the 2 years. Grief, when it is wrapped in shame, cannot get out. But on the morning the magistrate's men came to Fenmore Hall to take down her own account of the case, formally, respectfully, calling her Miss Ashcombe and writing her words as though they were worth the ink, something in her that had been held rigid since the courtroom finally gave way. And she went out alone into the walled garden where the first green things were pushing up through the cold ground, the rosemary she had freed and the physic beds she had begun to bring back, and she knelt down in the middle of them, and she cried as she had needed to cry for 2 years, not for herself at all, but for a good gentle man who had died believing the world would always call him guilty, and who had been right about that, and wrong, thank God, about it lasting. When she had cried herself empty, she stayed on her knees a while among the green beginnings, and something that had been clenched tight in her for 2 years quietly let go. Her father's knowledge had not died with him. It was in her hands and in her memory, and in the ordered beds coming slowly back to life around her, and she resolved, kneeling there in the cold earth, that she would not let it lie idle in a duchess's garden as a pretty ornament. Before the year was out, she had the physic garden at Fenmore Hall growing in earnest, and had begun, quietly, in her father's own unfashionable way, to see to the small ills of the moor folk who lived too far from any town to send for a physician, asking nothing for it, keeping careful honest books, doing the patient work that had once pulled a dying boy back from the dark. The county, which had lately learned to be ashamed of how it had used one Ashcombe, took a great deal of comfort in finding it could be proud of another. Linnet let them. It was a better use for them than most they had put themselves to before. The Duke found her there. He did not write her a note. He had, in truth, hardly written a note since the assembly, for he had discovered his voice again, like a man discovering a room in his own house. He had forgotten, and used it now, still roughly, still sparingly, but for her, always for her. He came and knelt down in the cold earth beside her without a word, and put his arms around her, and held her while she wept into the shoulder of a duke among the winter herbs, and when the worst of it had passed, he spoke, close to her ear, in that low, rescued voice. He would be glad, said Eldrick, that it was you who did not give up on him, as he did not give up on a dying boy that no one else would sit with. I think that is a thing your father would understand better than anyone. That some debts are not paid, they are only carried forward to the next person who needs them. They were married in the spring, quietly, in a small church below the moor, with Lady Marrow weeping magnificently in the front pew and telling everyone within reach that she had known from the very first night, from the moment the girl came in out of the cold, that it would come to this, which was not in the least true, and which no one had the heart to correct. The whole moor came to it, the tenants and the cottagers and the far-scattered households she had begun to physic. A great many of them people the old county would never have thought worth a place in a duke's church, and the duke had seen to it that there was room for every one of them, for he had spent 10 years learning what it was to be counted as no one. And he did not mean to keep a wedding that pretended some people mattered, and others did not. Lady Marrow disapproved of the arrangement very loudly and enjoyed it enormously. Lynette wore no borrowed gown that day. She wore her own, and she walked to him on her own feet down the short aisle, and when the moment came for her to speak, she found she could not stop looking at him, this grave, silent man learning to be neither, who had smiled at her across a room full of enemies and never once let go of her hand since. He had asked her properly, of course, some weeks before, and he had asked her in ink, which she had insisted upon, for she loved his rough, recovered voice, but the courtship had been conducted in pencil, and she would have the proposal match it. He had written it on a single folded page and laid it upon her pillow, where the first one had lain, months and a lifetime before. For the next 2 hours, it said, and for every 2 hours after that, for all the 2 hours there are, be my betrothed in earnest, and then my wife, and never again anyone's debt or bargain or property, but only, if you will have him, your own. I will even learn to let you thank me. He had signed it, for the first time in all their pages, not with the single letter of his title, but with the first letter of the given name she had handed back to him before a room full of enemies. She had written her answer beneath it in her own hand, and left it on the table by the library door where so many pages had passed between them that winter. Yes, she had written, and you need not learn to let me thank you. I mean to spend the rest of my life doing it, whether you let me or not. Years afterward, when they had children who found it very hard to believe that their talkative father had ever gone a single day without speaking, let alone 10 years, for the house they were growing up in was a loud and warm one, full of voices and argument and Lady Marrow's endless commentary from her chair by the fire, as though the place were making up all at once for the 10 silent years, as perhaps it was. There hung in a small frame on the wall of the library at Fenmore Hall a single folded page, foxed with age, 3 lines in a small even hand, and beneath them a single letter for a signature. Visitors sometimes asked about it, for it seemed a strange, humble thing to frame and keep among the portraits and the silver. The Duchess would only smile and say that it was the first honest thing anyone had ever offered her, and that a silent man had written it, and that she had kept it because it had asked for nothing and given her everything, which was, she had come to believe, the only clean way there was to give. And in the walled garden below the window, spring after spring, the physic beds came up green and ordered under a knowing hand, foxglove and feverfew and rosemary and rue, the whole green library of a good man's knowledge kept alive by his daughter in a house where no one was ever again bought or priced or made to be afraid.